Detective Richard Brooks stood at his desk, staring at the wall of photos and sticky notes that had taken over his office. Each image showed a different pharmacy, and each note contained details about robberies that had been terrorizing the north side of Chicago for the past 3 months. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed as he took another sip, his eyes fixed on the evidence before him. "Another hit last night," Officer Wilson said, dropping a fresh case file on Brooks's desk. "Same pattern. Guy walks in just before closing, shows a note claiming he has a weapon, takes specific medications, and disappears into thin air." Brooks grabbed the file, flipping through it with practiced speed. This would make it the 8th pharmacy robbery in 10 weeks. The pressure from above was mounting, and he could feel his chance at sergeant slipping away with each new incident. He'd worked 15 years for this promotion, and he wasn't about to let some drugstore robber ruin it for him. His reputation in the Chicago Police Department was built on closing cases fast. Some called him Lightning Brooks because of how quickly he could wrap up an investigation. Others, particularly the older detectives, warned him that speed wasn't everything in police work. But Brooks had learned early in his career that quick results got you noticed, and getting noticed got you promoted. The precinct buzzed with its usual morning energy as Brooks made his way to the break room. Uniformed officers shuffled in and out, sharing updates and friendly jokes. The smell of burnt coffee and microwaved leftovers filled the air. It felt like any other day, but Brooks knew it wasn't. The captain had made it clear yesterday, either they caught this pharmacy robber or heads would roll. "You look like you're about to wear a hole in that floor," said Jerry, the veteran desk sergeant who'd been with the department longer than Brooks had been alive. "Sometimes the harder you look, the less you see." Brooks managed a tight smile. Jerry was old school, always preaching about patience and thoroughness. But times had changed. In today's world, you needed results, and you needed them fast. Social media, 24-hour news cycles, and impatient bosses didn't wait for old-school detective work. Back at his desk, Brooks spread out the security camera photos from all 8 robberies. The suspect was careful, always wearing a baseball cap and keeping his head down. But something about the latest footage caught his eye. The way the suspect moved, the slight pivot of his left leg, it reminded him of someone. He pulled up the department's database and started searching through recent arrest records. His mind raced through possibilities, connecting dots that others might have missed. That's when he saw it, a minor shoplifting arrest from 2 months ago. The suspect had been caught stealing cold medicine from a convenience store. He worked as a stock clerk at one of the pharmacies that hadn't been hit yet. Brooks felt his heart rate pick up. This could be it, the break he needed. The pieces all seemed to fit. Someone with inside knowledge of pharmacies, desperate enough to steal medicine, physically matching the robber's description. He didn't need to wait for more evidence. His instincts had never failed him before, and time was running out. He grabbed his jacket and car keys, already imagining how this arrest would look on his record. One more high-profile case solved, just in time for the promotion board to review his application. Some might call it rushing, but Brooks preferred to think of it as being decisive. As he drove through the morning traffic, Brooks rehearsed how he'd present the case to the captain. 8 robberies solved in one arrest would make headlines. The brass would love it, the public would feel safer, and he'd finally get that surgeon's badge he'd been chasing. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he sped toward what he thought would be his crowning achievement, was that this case would change everything. His rush to judgment, his eagerness to close the case quickly, would set in motion a chain of events that would affect not just his career, but the lives of innocent people who had the misfortune of crossing his path. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Brooks parked his unmarked car near his target's workplace. He adjusted his tie and checked his weapon, going through the motions he'd performed countless times before. But this arrest felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the promotion hanging over him, or maybe it was something else, a quiet voice of doubt he chose to ignore. Little did he know, as he walked into that pharmacy with confidence bordering on arrogance, that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. A mistake that would teach him the true meaning of justice and the heavy price of rushing to judgment. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Brooks stepped into the fluorescent-lit store, ready to make an arrest that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved, in ways none of them could have predicted. The morning shift at Preston's pharmacy had just begun when Detective Brooks walked in. Behind the counter, Tom Chen was carefully counting pills for a prescription, completely unaware that his life was about to turn upside down. At 32, Tom had spent the last decade building a quiet, respectable life. He worked 2 jobs, mornings at the pharmacy and evenings at a local grocery store, all to support his elderly mother who suffered from early-stage dementia. "Can I help you?" Tom asked, looking up from his work with the friendly smile he gave all customers. Instead of a response, he was met with Detective Brooks flashing his badge, followed by 2 uniformed officers entering through the front door. "Tom Chen?" Brooks's voice carried through the store, causing several early morning customers to turn and stare. "I need you to step out from behind the counter." Tom's hands began to shake slightly, but he did as he was told. His mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to his mother? Was there a problem with his taxes? Never did he imagine what was coming next. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Brooks commanded, already reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the robbery of multiple pharmacies across the north side." The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Tom's wrists as his world collapsed around him. "There must be some mistake," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't robbed anything. I work here. I've worked here for 3 years." But Brooks wasn't listening. He was too focused on the way Tom's left leg seemed to favor his right, just like the suspect in the surveillance footage. The fact that Tom's limp came from an old high school basketball injury didn't matter to the detective. In Brooks's mind, this was just another piece of evidence pointing to guilt. The store manager, Mr. Reynolds, came rushing out from his office. "What's going on? There must be some mistake. Tom is one of my best employees." "Sir, please step back," Brooks said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is an ongoing investigation." As they led Tom out of the store, his regular customers watched in shock. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who came in every Tuesday for her heart medication, covered her mouth in disbelief. She'd known Tom for years. He always took extra time to explain her prescriptions and even helped her carry her bags to her car when it rained. At the police station, Tom sat in the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room. His work shirt was wrinkled, and his name tag still hung crooked on his chest, a small detail that seemed to mock the normalcy of the life he had just hours ago. "Just tell us about the robberies, and this can all be over," Brooks said, spreading photos across the table. "We have surveillance footage, witness descriptions, and your work history gives you inside knowledge of pharmacy operations." "Please," Tom pleaded, his voice cracking. "I need to call my mother. She's waiting for me to bring her medication. She gets confused if I'm not there on time." But Brooks saw the mention of medication as another sign of guilt. "Is that how you got the idea? Taking care of your mother gave you access to information about prescription drugs." Hours passed in that small room. Tom repeated his story again and again. He was innocent, he had alibis, he could prove where he was during several of the robberies. But Brooks had already made up his mind. Every denial was seen as further proof of guilt, every explanation twisted into evidence of deception. What Brooks didn't know was that during one of the robberies, Tom had been at his second job, stocking shelves at the grocery store under the watchful eye of 16 security cameras. During another, he'd been at the hospital with his mother during one of her episodes. But in his rush to close the case, Brooks hadn't bothered to verify these alibis. As evening approached, Tom's thoughts kept returning to his mother. Who would give her the evening medications? Who would make sure she had dinner? Who would remind her what day it was when she got confused? The weight of these responsibilities pressed down on him harder than the handcuffs ever could. "I can't confess to something I didn't do," Tom said finally, exhaustion evident in every word. "I have a mother who depends on me. I have 2 jobs because I need them both. Why would I risk everything by robbing pharmacies?" But his words fell on deaf ears. Brooks was already filling out the paperwork, already imagining how this arrest would look to the promotion board. In his mind, the case was closed. As Tom was led to a holding cell, his entire life packed into a small property bag, he couldn't help but wonder how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. His mother would be waiting by the window now, watching for him to come home. His evening shift at the grocery store would go uncovered. The carefully balanced life he'd built was falling apart, all because one detective was too eager to close a case to look for the truth. What neither of them knew was that the real pharmacy robber was watching the evening news, seeing Tom's arrest being reported as the end of the crime spree. And while Tom faced his first night behind bars, the true criminal was already planning his next target, knowing the police would no longer be looking for him. 6 months can feel like an eternity when you're sitting in a jail cell. For Tom Chen, each day brought new worries about his mother and the life he'd worked so hard to build. The small calendar on his cell wall showed dozens of X marks, each one representing another day of freedom lost, another day his elderly mother spent without her son's care. Meanwhile, Detective Brooks sat in his new office, a small plaque reading Sergeant now proudly displayed on his desk. The promotion board had been impressed by his quick resolution of the pharmacy robbery case. Local newspapers had run headlines praising the police department's efficiency, and Brooks's superiors had held him up as an example of proactive police work. "Your numbers this quarter are impressive," Captain Reynolds said during a staff meeting, nodding approvingly at Brooks. 8 robberies solved with 1 arrest. That's the kind of efficiency we need more of in this department. Brooks smiled and accepted the praise, pushing down the small voice of doubt that occasionally whispered in the back of his mind. He'd learned to ignore that voice, just as he'd learned to ignore the letters that arrived from Tom's public defender, pointing out inconsistencies in the case. In the county jail, Tom's life had become a monotonous routine of bland meals, brief yard time, and endless worry. His cellmate, an older man serving time for unpaid traffic tickets, often found him staring at the single photo he was allowed to keep, a picture of him and his mother at his college graduation. "My neighbor promised to check on her," Tom said one night, his voice barely audible over the usual prison noise. "But she gets so confused. Sometimes she doesn't recognize people she's known for years. She needs familiar faces, routine. She needs her son." The truth about Tom's mother was even harder than he knew. Without his income from 2 jobs, she'd been forced to leave her comfortable senior living apartment. The state had moved her to a government-funded facility, the kind of place where staff were overworked, activities were minimal, and personal attention was a luxury they couldn't afford. Mrs. Chen spent most of her days sitting by a window in the facility's common room, asking anyone who would listen if they'd seen her son. "He's usually here by now," she'd say, confusion clouding her eyes. "He brings my medicine and tells me about his day at the pharmacy." The facility staff had given up trying to explain where Tom was. It only upset her more, and she'd forget the explanation within hours anyway. They simply nodded and patted her hand, promising that someone would come soon. Back at the police department, life moved on. Brooks threw himself into new cases, building on his reputation for quick results. But something was different now. Each time he made an arrest, that quiet voice of doubt grew a little louder. He started noticing details that didn't quite fit, explanations he might have overlooked before. Then came the morning headlines that would change everything. Pharmacy robberies continue despite arrest. 3 new incidents, identical to the previous ones, had occurred in neighboring districts. The robber's method was exactly the same. A note claiming he had a weapon, specific medications taken, a clean getaway. Brooks sat at his desk, staring at the newspaper. His coffee grew cold as he read and reread the article. The new robberies perfectly matched the pattern of the ones he'd attributed to Tom Chen. Every detail was the same, right down to the types of medications taken. In the jail's visiting room, Tom sat across from his public defender, separated by thick glass. The lawyer's expression was grim as he explained about the new robberies. "This could be what we need," the lawyer said, his voice tinny through the old phone system. "It proves you couldn't have committed the original crimes. You've been here for the past 6 months, but the robberies are continuing." Tom should have felt hopeful, but all he could think about was his mother. 6 months of her life had been stolen, time they could never get back. 6 months where her condition had deteriorated without the routine and care she needed. 6 months where everything he'd worked for had crumbled away. In his new surgeon's office, Brooks pulled out Tom's case file. This time, he forced himself to read every page carefully, including the alibi statements he previously dismissed. He looked at security footage from Tom's second job, time-stamped during one of the original robberies. He read statements from Tom's co-workers, his mother's doctors, his neighbors, all corroborating his story. The evidence of Tom's innocence had been there all along, buried under Brooks's rush to close the case, hidden beneath his ambition for promotion. As he sat there, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Brooks began to understand the true cost of his haste. But the real wake-up call came later that afternoon. A detective from another precinct called, excited about a break in the new pharmacy robberies. They'd caught the real perpetrator on camera, his face clearly visible for the first time. The timestamp on the footage showed him robbing a pharmacy while Tom Chen sat in a jail cell, his life and his mother's well-being destroyed by a detective too eager for promotion to care about the truth. The weight of what he'd done hit Brooks all at once. His promotion, his reputation, his entire career had been built on a foundation of rushed judgments and ignored evidence. And somewhere in a county jail cell, an innocent man was paying the price for his ambition. Officer Amy Baker wasn't supposed to be working late that night. She'd only stayed behind to organize case files, a tedious task that nobody else wanted to do. As a rookie officer still proving herself, she often got stuck with the paperwork nobody else wanted to handle. But that night, her dedication would change lives. The precinct was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of phones ringing. Amy sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of case files, when something caught her eye. She was reviewing recent robbery reports when she noticed a pattern that made her sit up straight in her chair. "This can't be right," she muttered to herself, spreading out photos from different case files. The new pharmacy robberies that had been happening in the neighboring district looked identical to the ones Sergeant Brooks had supposedly solved months ago. Not just similar, identical. Amy pulled up the original case files on her computer, the ones that had led to Tom Chen's arrest. Her eyes moved between the old cases and the new ones, checking and double-checking every detail. The more she looked, the more her stomach knotted with the realization that something was terribly wrong. "Hey, Richards," she called out to the only other officer still in the office. "Can you take a look at something?" Officer Richards, a veteran who'd seen it all in his 20 years on the force, walked over. He adjusted his reading glasses as Amy laid out the evidence before him. "Look at these security camera shots," she said, pointing to images from both sets of robberies. "The way the suspect moves, the types of medications taken, even the handwriting on the threat notes, they're exactly the same. But this man has been in jail for 6 months." Richards leaned in closer, his expression growing more serious with each comparison. "Keep digging," he said finally. "But be careful. Brooks won't like anyone questioning his big case." Amy spent the next week gathering evidence. She reviewed every security tape she could find, interviewed witnesses again, and created a timeline that made it impossible for Tom Chen to have committed the original robberies. But her most significant breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A new security camera had been installed at a coffee shop across from one of the recently robbed pharmacies. The footage showed the robber clearly for the first time, and it definitely wasn't Tom Chen. The real perpetrator was a former pharmacy technician who'd lost his license due to drug addiction. He'd been hitting pharmacies across multiple districts, using his inside knowledge to know exactly what to take and when to strike. Amy's hands shook as she compiled all the evidence into a report. She knew what this meant, not just for Tom Chen, but for the department and especially for Sergeant Brooks. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophic failure of justice, driven by ambition and rushed judgment. "You wanted to see me?" Captain Reynolds said, looking up from his desk as Amy entered his office the next morning. She'd requested an urgent meeting, something rookie officers rarely did. "Yes, sir," Andy replied, placing her carefully prepared report on his desk. "It's about the pharmacy robbery cases. The ones Sergeant Brooks closed 6 months ago." The captain's expression remained neutral as Amy walked him through the evidence. She showed him the security footage, the timeline discrepancies, and the proof that the real robber had been active while Tom Chen sat in jail. With each piece of evidence, the captain's face grew more grave. "How did we miss this?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. They both knew how. Brooks had been so focused on closing the case quickly that he ignored anything that didn't fit his theory. While this revelation was unfolding at the precinct, Tom Chen sat in his jail cell, unaware that his world was about to change again. He'd stopped counting days on his calendar, stopped asking about his mother's condition, stopped hoping for justice. But fate, in the form of a dedicated rookie officer, had other plans. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. Internal Affairs was notified. Urgent meetings were held behind closed doors. Brooks was called in to face the evidence he'd overlooked or ignored. His protests grew weaker as each new piece of evidence was presented, until finally he sat in silence, the weight of what he'd done pressing down on him. Tom's public defender received an urgent call from the district attorney's office. Emergency motions were filed. Judges were contacted. The machinery of justice, which had ground so slowly for the past 6 months, suddenly began moving at lightning speed. But for Amy, the most important moment came when she visited the nursing home where Tom's mother had been placed. Mrs. Chen sat in her usual spot by the window, clutching an old photo of her son. "We found the truth," Amy told her, though she wasn't sure how much the elderly woman understood. "Your son is coming home." In his cell, Tom was trying to sleep when the guards came. He'd learned to ignore late-night activities in the jail, but this time they were calling his name. As he was led to the processing area, he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Words like evidence and immediate release and wrongful imprisonment. Outside the jail, the night air felt different on his skin. Freedom had a smell he'd forgotten. But mixed with the joy of release was anger at the system that had failed him, worry about his mother, and uncertainty about the life he'd have to rebuild. Back at the precinct, Amy sat at her desk, looking at the security footage that had broken the case. She thought about how easy it would have been to ignore those files, to let someone else handle it, to look the other way. But that wasn't why she'd become a police officer. She'd sworn to protect and serve, and sometimes that meant protecting people from the very system meant to serve them. The press conference room at the police department had never felt so crowded. Reporters packed the space, cameras flashing as the police chief stepped up to the podium. Behind him, a large screen showed Tom Chen's booking photo next to the surveillance image of the real pharmacy robber. The contrast between the two men was stark and damning. "Today, we are here to acknowledge a grave error in our justice system," the chief began, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. 6 months ago, an innocent man was arrested and imprisoned for crimes he did not commit. That man was Tom Chen, a hard-working member of our community who dedicated his life to caring for his elderly mother. In the back of the room, Sergeant Brooks stood against the wall, his new sergeant's badge feeling like it was burning through his shirt. Each word from the chief was another nail in the coffin of his career, another reminder of how his rush to judgment had destroyed an innocent life. The chief continued, detailing how Officer Amy Baker's thorough investigation had uncovered the truth. As he spoke, Brooks noticed his former colleagues stepping away from him, creating a small bubble of isolation in the crowded room. The same officers who had congratulated him on his promotion months ago now couldn't meet his eyes. Across town, Tom sat in his small apartment, watching the press conference on TV. The place felt strange after 6 months away. A layer of dust covered everything, unopened mail was piled on the table, and the plants his mother had loved were long dead. The apartment complex manager had only kept his unit because of public pressure after his story hit the news. His mother's empty bedroom door stayed closed. He couldn't bear to look at it, knowing she was still in that nursing home, confused and alone. The facility's doctor had advised against moving her immediately. The change in environment might be too disruptive for her condition. 6 months of institutional care had taken their toll. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since his release. Reporters wanted interviews, lawyers wanted to discuss civil suits, and well-meaning neighbors wanted to help. Tom let everything go to voicemail. How could he explain what it felt like to lose half a year of his life? How could he describe watching his carefully built world crumble because one detective was too ambitious to care about the truth? Back at the police department, internal affairs investigators had taken over Brooks's office. They went through every case he handled, looking for similar patterns of rushed judgments and ignored evidence. Files covered every surface as they dug through years of arrests, convictions, and closed cases. "Look at this one," one investigator said to another, holding up a file. 3 witnesses with conflicting statements, all dismissed without follow-up. Conviction secured based on circumstantial evidence. As they dug deeper, more cases began to show problematic patterns. Brooks had built his career on quick closures and high conviction rates, but at what cost? How many other lives had been affected by his rush to judgment? The real pharmacy robber, now in custody, had confessed to all the crimes, both the original series and the recent ones. He described how he'd watched the news of Tom's arrest with disbelief, knowing he'd been handed a perfect opportunity to continue his spree. While an innocent man sat in jail, he'd hit 6 more pharmacies across 3 districts. Officer Baker found herself suddenly thrust into the spotlight. The department needed a hero to counterbalance the scandal, and her diligent work provided that narrative. But late at night, reviewing more of Brooks's old cases, she wondered how many other Tom Chens were out there, innocent people whose lives had been upended by a system too focused on quick results. Brooks sat alone in his home, surrounded by commendations and awards that now felt meaningless. His wife had taken their kids to her mother's house, saying they needed space to process everything. His phone was filled with missed calls from reporters and angry messages from defense attorneys reviewing his old cases. On his coffee table lay a letter from the department's review board, scheduling his hearing for next week. The words "gross misconduct" and "pattern of negligence" jumped out from the page. His union representative had already warned him to expect termination, possibly even criminal charges for misconduct under color of authority. The story had gone national. News outlets ran special reports about rush to judgment in police work, using Tom's case as a prime example. Expert panels discussed the pressure for quick results in law enforcement and how it could lead to wrongful convictions. Tom's story became a rallying cry for criminal justice reform advocates. Local community groups organized support for Tom and his mother. A fundraiser to help with his mother's medical care exceeded its goal within hours. His former employers at both the pharmacy and grocery store offered his jobs back, with back pay for the time he'd lost. But no amount of money or support could fully repair the damage done to his family. Tom spent his first week of freedom beside his mother's bed at the nursing home, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of clarity. Sometimes she recognized him, her face lighting up with joy. Other times she stared at him in confusion, asking why he'd been gone so long. Each time she forgot, he had to decide whether to explain again or simply sit with her in silence. The weight of what he'd done hit Brooks hardest when he drove past Tom's mother's nursing home. He saw the small room through the window, saw the confused elderly woman who'd lost precious months with her son because of his actions. All his excuses about pressure and performance metrics felt hollow in the face of that human cost. As the sun set on another day of investigations and revelations, Tom sat by his mother's window, watching the city lights come on. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more lawyers, more decisions about how to rebuild his shattered life. But for now, he just held his mother's hand, making up for lost time that could never truly be recovered. The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered. Former Sergeant Brooks sat at the defendant's table, his once crisp uniform replaced by a civilian suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. The past month had aged him visibly, his hair grayer, his face lined with stress, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his actions. In the matter of professional misconduct and civil rights violations, the judge began, her voice echoing through the packed courtroom. Tom Chen sat in the front row, watching the man who had stolen 6 months of his life face the consequences of his actions. The evidence against Brooks had mounted quickly once investigators began digging. His pattern of rushed arrests and ignored evidence stretched back years. 5 other wrongful arrests had been discovered, though none had resulted in as much jail time as Tom's case. Each victim was present in the courtroom, their faces a silent testimony to the human cost of Brooks's ambition. The defendant's actions show a disturbing pattern of misconduct, the prosecutor stated, gesturing to the stack of case files on his desk. In his pursuit of promotions and accolades, he consistently prioritized quick arrests over thorough investigation. The result was not just one wrongful imprisonment, but a systematic abuse of the justice system. Brooks stared at his hands as his own record was read back to him. Each case represented someone whose life he'd disrupted, whose trust in the system he'd shattered. His wife sat 3 rows back, their teenage children conspicuously absent. They'd stopped speaking to him weeks ago, unable to reconcile the father they knew with the man being described in news reports. "My daughter won't even look at me anymore," Brooks had confided to his lawyer the day before. She's always wanted to be a police officer like her dad. Now she says she'd rather work at a fast food restaurant than wear a badge. The civil lawsuits had already begun. 6 plaintiffs, led by Tom Chen, were seeking damages for wrongful arrest and imprisonment. Brooks's house was on the market. They needed the money for legal fees and to pay what insurance wouldn't cover. His wife had already moved in with her sister, taking their children to a new school district where nobody knew their name. "I just want to know why," Tom had said during his testimony earlier that week. "Why didn't you check my alibis? Why didn't you look at the evidence that showed I was innocent? Was your promotion really worth destroying my life and my mother's care?" Brooks had no good answers. Every explanation sounded hollow, even to himself. The pressure for results, the department's emphasis on quick closures, his own ambition, none of it justified what he'd done to innocent people. The nursing home bills had kept coming even while Tom was in jail. His mother's condition had deteriorated significantly during his absence. The facility's staff testified about how she asked for her son every day, how her confusion had worsened without his regular visits, how she'd stopped eating properly and lost dangerous amounts of weight. The real tragedy here, Tom's lawyer addressed the court, is not just the 6 months my client spent in jail. It's the irreplaceable time stolen from an elderly woman with dementia. It's the trust broken between police and community. It's the other victims who are only now discovering that their arrests were part of this man's pattern of misconduct. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding police reform. The case had become a symbol of everything wrong with a system that valued quick arrests over careful investigation. Local news crews interviewed community activists, former colleagues, and legal experts about the broader implications of the case. Brooks's former partner sat in the back of the courtroom, remembering all the times he'd had doubts about their arrests but had stayed quiet. "You were too aggressive," he'd finally told Brooks during the investigation. "I saw it, but I never said anything. That makes me part of the problem too." The police department had already implemented changes. New protocols required multiple officers to review evidence before arrests in major cases. Body camera footage had to be reviewed in its entirety, not just clips that supported the arresting officer's theory. Promotions would no longer be based primarily on arrest and closure rates. "The defendant's actions have cost this department its credibility," the chief had testified. "We're not just losing one sergeant, we're losing the community's trust, something that takes years to build and only moments to destroy." As the judge prepared to announce her decision, Brooks looked back at his wife. She'd stood by him through 20 years on the force, through late nights and dangerous situations. But this was different. This wasn't about the risks of the job. This was about choices he'd made, people he'd hurt, lives he'd damaged through his own arrogance. The civil settlements would take everything they'd saved. Their children's college funds, their retirement accounts, even their home, all of it would go to compensating his victims. His pension was already forfeit. At 52, he would have to start over, carrying not just the financial burden, but the weight of what he'd done to innocent people. Richard Brooks, the judge addressed him directly, using his civilian name rather than his former rank. "You were entrusted with extraordinary power, the power to deprive citizens of their liberty. With that power comes an equally extraordinary responsibility to use it wisely and justly. You failed not just the specific victims of your misconduct, but the entire community you swore to protect and serve." The sentence, when it came, would change everything. But for Brooks, the real punishment wasn't the legal consequences. It was knowing that his children would grow up ashamed of their father's actions. It was seeing his wife's disappointment every time she looked at him. It was understanding, finally and too late, the true cost of his ambition. 5 years passed like water under a bridge. The small security office where Richard Brooks now worked looked nothing like his old police surgeon's office. A simple desk, 2 monitors showing feeds from various cameras, and a well-worn chair were his new professional world. The shopping mall where he worked wasn't exactly a hotbed of crime, but it gave him plenty of time to think about how his life had changed. His security guard uniform felt different from his old police blues, lighter somehow, but carrying a heavier weight of memory. The teenagers who sometimes caused trouble in the mall had no idea that the quiet man who asked them to move along had once been a decorated police sergeant. The store owners who nodded to him as he made his rounds didn't know his story. and that was exactly how he wanted it. "Mr. Brooks," called out Mrs. Wilson from the jewelry store, "could you keep an eye on the store while I run to the bathroom? It'll just take a minute." "Of course," he replied with a small smile. These simple interactions, based on basic trust and kindness, meant more to him now than any commendation he'd received in his previous life. During his breaks, Brooks volunteered at the Wrongful Conviction Resource Center, just a few blocks from the mall. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once wrongfully imprisoned others now worked to free them. He didn't talk much about his past there, but his experience gave him a unique perspective on the cases they handled. "There's something not right about this arrest report," he said one afternoon, reviewing a case file with the center's legal team. They rushed to close the case. See how they ignored these witness statements, how they didn't follow up on the alibi. He saw himself in every rushed investigation, every corners cut, every assumption made to close a case quickly. But now he used that knowledge to help others, to prevent what he'd done to Tom Chen from happening to someone else. Across town, Tom had rebuilt his life piece by piece. The settlement money had allowed him to move his mother to a better care facility, one with specialized dementia programs and more attentive staff. He visited her every day, even though she sometimes didn't recognize him anymore. "You look like my son," she'd said on her bad days, patting his hand with a confused smile. "He works at a pharmacy, you know. Such a good boy." Tom had opened his own small pharmacy using part of the settlement money. He'd named it Second Chance Pharmacy and made a point of hiring people who needed exactly that, second chances. His staff included former inmates who'd served their time, recovering addicts who'd turned their lives around, and others whose society had been quick to judge. The local paper had done a story about his business, focusing on his journey from wrongfully imprisoned man to successful business owner. But what caught Brooks's attention wasn't the business angle, it was the quote about forgiveness. "I can't forget what happened," Tom had told the reporter, "but I've learned that holding on to anger only imprisons you in a different way. The best revenge is living well and helping others avoid the same fate." Brooks kept that article in his wallet, worn and creased from frequent reading. It reminded him that redemption was possible, even if forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. His own children had slowly started speaking to him again. His daughter, now in college studying criminal justice, had written a powerful essay about her father's case and the importance of ethical law enforcement. She'd gotten an A, but more importantly, writing it had helped her understand how good people could make terrible mistakes when they lost sight of what really mattered. "Dad," she'd said during a recent visit, "I used to be ashamed of what happened. But now I use your story to remind myself and my classmates why we need to do better. Why we can never let ambition blind us to human cost." The police department had changed too. Brooks's case was now part of the training curriculum, a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment. Officer Baker, who'd uncovered the truth, had risen through the ranks to become a detective herself, known for her methodical and thorough investigations. One rainy Tuesday, Brooks was surprised to see Tom Chen walk into the mall. Their eyes met briefly across the atrium. Tom gave a small nod, not quite forgiveness, but acknowledgement. They'd never spoken directly since the trial, but that simple gesture said more than words could. Later that evening, Brooks sat in on a support group meeting at the resource center. A young officer from a neighboring district had come seeking advice. He'd been pressured to close cases quickly, to boost the department's statistics, and he was struggling with the ethical implications. "I used to be you," Brooks told him, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I thought quick results meant good police work. I thought closing cases fast would make me a better officer. I was wrong. Let me tell you a story about a pharmacy worker named Tom Chen." As he shared his story one more time, Brooks looked around the room. The faces looking back at him weren't judging, they were learning. His greatest failure had become a powerful teaching tool, a way to prevent others from making the same mistakes. The security cameras blinked silently on his desk, marking the end of another quiet day at the mall. Brooks gathered his things, ready to head home. Tomorrow, he'd be back here, doing his small part to protect and serve in a much humbler way. And somehow that felt more honest, more meaningful than all his years chasing promotions and praise. As he walked to his car, he passed a pharmacy in the mall. Through the window, he could see a young worker helping an elderly customer with patience and kindness. It reminded him of Tom, of all the lives touched by his mistakes, and of the ongoing work of redemption. The badge on his security uniform caught the light, not a symbol of power anymore, but a reminder of responsibility, humility, and the endless work of making things right.